A warm welcome to everyone here and a warm welcome to all of those following us online. Don't be careless. Your overconfidence is your weakness. What am I quoting here? The Ukrainian app, which urges Ukrainians to seek shelter from Russian missiles and drones. And when the alert is over, the message is, may the force be with you. And yes, to keep up the spirit, the voice is indeed Mark Hamill's from Star Wars. The reasons why I opened this year's conference with this fact is threefold. First of all, it reminds us that there is a war in Europe. While we meet here right next to the hyggelige Tivoli Gardens to talk about the future, airstrikes and shelter are the reality in Ukraine. Just take the appalling attack this weekend in Kharkiv. Secondly, you could argue that being careless and overconfident is an apt description of how we ended up where we are, with a war in Ukraine, a lack of investments in European defense, an over-reliance on Chinese imports, and overuse of fossil fuels, just to mention a few of those instances where we've been careless in Europe. And finally, let the force be with you carries a message of hope. Europe is not bound for failure. It is Europe's strategic choices that will decide the future of our continent, and it is exactly those choices that we will debate here today. Our discussions take place 8 days before the election to the European Parliament, 30 days before the EU summit in Brussels, where the top jobs could be decided, and 396 days before Denmark takes over the EU presidency in the second half of 2025. I'll not mention all the challenges, don't worry, that the EU faces, but just mention three. First of all, the war in Ukraine. Is it really our war? And if this is the case, what is the long-term answer with regards to weapon delivery, but obviously also EU enlargement? Secondly, how to respond to the United States of America that's engaged in a great power competition with China and is subsidizing its industry. Just think about the Inflation Reduction Act. And how can we Trump-proof our core policies? Should we have Trump 2.0 around the corner and not Biden 2.0? And finally, how do we deal with the fact that Europe's global power has diminished? This will also be one of our core themes today. So it is an intense day we have in front of us. We're extremely grateful that our international speakers have decided to come here. This is a really, really busy moment for all of you with the election to the European Parliament, so thank you very much for that. We'll start with all the international speakers, and then after the break, we move on to what does it mean for Denmark, and that's where the Danish Prime Minister will come here, and also the two leaders of the opposition, and the key leading Danish economist, Mr. Euro Niels Thyssen, and we will also go live to Kiev. So let the force be with you, and let's get started. There is a first time for everything. Sorry to start with this cliche, but Mujtaba Rahman, you are one of the best and the brightest when it gets to the European Union, although your country has left the EU. You are the first port of call for everyone dealing with European Union affairs, trying to figure out what's going to happen, what's going to be around the corner. And your famous Twitter or X account is an account that can make anybody, particularly a think tank director, jealous. But as some of you have guessed by now, you have never been to wonderful Copenhagen. So now you're here, and thank you very much for that. Who knows, maybe you're here because Denmark has had its own Zeitenwende and has become a more relevant stopover, you could say, for anybody dealing with EU affairs. Anyway, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for coming.
So thank you for having me here today to talk about the European elections and the implications that will follow. I'm going to organize my remarks over 6 main ideas. As I prepared my intervention for today, I tried not to be too gloomy, but I'm afraid I am going to be quite gloomy. I think I've learned as a general rule, it's better to say what you think rather than what your audience may want to hear. And it's in that spirit that I've prepared the remarks today. So what are the 6 ideas? idea number one, von der Leyen is going to win a second term as Commission President. Secondly, the fear of a populist resurgence at the European level is really overdone in our view. There will be more right-wing parliamentarians in Brussels, but they will come nowhere close to organizing. They won't have a majority, and I think their disorganization will act as a major brake on their impact and influence over Europe's political and policy priorities over the next 5 years. Thirdly, the major negative externalities that do emerge from the European elections will be felt at home, not in Brussels, but in particular in countries where you have weak governments and weak incumbent leaders. And in particular, here I'm thinking about France and I'm thinking about Germany. France, over the medium term, is in particular trouble, and I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about what's happening there, because I do think that should trouble all of us. My fourth point is that the Weimar Triangle, so Poland, Germany, and France, are very important. My fifth point is so is Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. And my sixth point is so is the UK. I'll now unpack all of those ideas in turn. So European elections in 1 week. Normally, I would argue, these elections are of second or even tertiary order importance. This time around, I think it does feel different. I think Europe is at a very particular moment. There are serious geopolitical threats from Russia, from China. There are major concerns, I think, about a Donald Trump 2.0 presidency. In our view, Donald Trump will win the US election on the 5th of November. There is a major problem in Europe with weak leadership. There are competitiveness and fiscal challenges. And there are increasing temptations with illiberalism and major polarization at home. This is the context in which the elections are taking place, and it's for that reason I think the elections matter more this time around. Now, the good news, I think, is the results of the elections are not going to be as good for the far right as people assume and as the reporting would suggest. That's always been our view. The bad news, I think, is that's probably where the good news ends. Now, all of the recent polling, and we look at the polls very, very closely, suggests that the EPP, the centre-right, will come first, the socialists will come second, you will have Macron's centrist Renew Alliance probably coming third, maybe competing with Giorgia Meloni's European Conservative and Reformist group for third or fourth place. There is no chance of a coherent far-right majority emerging, as I've said. And so I think one can take that view with a fair level of confidence, and that tells us, I think, already a certain number of things. Number one, as I've said, von der Leyen is going to win a second term as Commission President. The socialists will claim the European Council. There is some speculation that your own Prime Minister may be heading to Brussels. I would argue, I was in Brussels a week ago, I spoke to every ambassador from every member state, and I think the clear frontrunner in my mind is Portugal's former Prime Minister, Antonio Costa. I'd be very surprised if he doesn't get the role, and I'm happy to talk about why in the Q&A afterwards. The second thing I think we can say with a fair amount of clarity is that the configuration that will emerge after the European elections will effectively enable von der Leyen to govern from the centre. There will be some dilution with respect to the green agenda. I think on migration issues, they will remain challenging. But fundamentally, if you look at the composition of the majority that's likely to emerge, I don't think there is a case to argue there will be major dilution of the things that von der Leyen achieved in the context of her first term. Now, just because, in our view, the European elections are more benign, perhaps, at the European level, that doesn't mean they're not of consequence. I think they are of major consequence, but the consequences I would point to, as I've said, lie back home. And I'm going to turn now to what's happening in France to justify and substantiate this argument I'm making. So, Macron, he's deeply unpopular back in France. He controls no majority in the National Assembly. He's running into the European election with a 15-point gap against Le Pen. Now, I think it's really important to look at Macron's new government. We have Gabriel Attal, 35 years old, youngest ever prime minister. We have a new foreign minister with a major network in Europe. He was Macron's man in the European Parliament before he moved over to the Quai d'Orsay. Their objective was to close this gap with Le Pen. Since they came to power, the gap has widened. The only constituency that Macron can work with in the National Assembly is the centre-right Les Républicains. They are hell-bent on undermining him. And the reason, of course, for doing that is they're looking to challenge for the Élysée in 2027. So there isn't really a formula for Macron to govern for the remaining 2.5 or 3 years off his term. I don't know if I would call him a lame duck in Europe, but in terms of his domestic agenda, it has completely run into the ground. I find it very hard to believe you're going to see any reforms of consequence coming from the Élysée over the course of the next 2.5 to 3 years. And the litmus test for that is the fact when Macron tries to promulgate reforms that the Republicans ideologically support, like pensions or immigration, they don't support the reforms passage in the National Assembly. And I say that's because they are attempting to win power in 2027. So that's the context in which we have to interpret a 15-point defeat at the hands of Le Pen running into next week's European election. It's the first vote since parliamentary elections in June 2022. For that reason, it will be considered a de facto midterm referendum on Macron's second term. It will be seen as a major crushing defeat for Macronism. It will, I think, create the risk of an early election. In our view, Macron will face a number of confidence votes after the Olympics in July. I think it's highly likely the government will fall, probably this year, and that may trigger an early election. We have to forecast these things for our clients and assign silly probabilities. So we have a 60% probability of an early election. And the scary thing, of course, about an early election, when you look at the polling, is that it is not inconceivable that Le Pen could come first. So we have a 20% chance that you could have a far-right prime minister in the Matignon this year. That's either Le Pen or it's her deputy, Jordan Bardella. Now, people may say these scenarios are completely crazy. A 20% probability of a Le Pen prime minister this year sounds insane, even if you think about it for more than 1 second. But that, I think, is the political context that Macron is grappling with. Now, the much bigger threat, of course, is 2027, when we will have a presidential election and the risk of a President Le Pen. And I think that risk looms large over Macron, and it looms large over everything Macron says or does. So, you know, we are now having a discussion about Europeanizing, to some extent, France's nuclear deterrent. And of course, the question you constantly get asked in Brussels is, well, what would Le Pen do? Macron supports Ukraine's accession into NATO, and he's a champion for Ukraine's integration into the EU. Of course, it raises the question, that's a 10, 15-year commitment. What would Le Pen do? Macron talks about doubling the financing capacity of the EU budget, or doubling the budget per se. If you look at Le Pen's programme, she wants to withhold France's 5 billion annual contribution to the EU budget. That, I think, is the problem. We know when you look at the electoral landscape in France that Le Pen will feature in the second round in 2027. I think that is obvious. That's not a brave view to take, but it is not obvious who her challenger will be. This is because the party that Macron built in 2017 is not really a political party. There is no chain of succession from Macron to a deputy. There is no line of command. There is no mechanism or process to replace Macron. And he, as we know, he's constitutionally barred from running for another term when he steps down in 2027. So the candidate could emerge from within his party. It could be Gabriel Attal. Could emerge from outside his party. Could be the former Prime Minister Edouard Philippe. Could be the finance minister. Could be the defense minister. We don't know. And I think that's the problem with France. The center is fragmented and the far right is consolidating. And that, I think, when I look at Europe and I think the risks confronting the European Union, this is the major existential populist threat that hangs over the EU over the medium term. And as I say, all of this subtracts from Macron's credibility. When he talks about the support for Ukraine, but then only has provided 3.8 billion in fiscal contributions to Ukraine. Denmark is doing 2.4% of its GDP in support of Ukraine. Of course, that subtracts from Macron's credibility. Now, if that's not gloomy enough, the situation in Germany isn't much better, I'm afraid. Germany's chancellor is weak. I think that's the truth. He is a poor communicator. He has little, if no, European agenda or vision, and he straddles a very fragmented coalition that has proven almost impossible to govern. There's a huge frustration. I spend a lot of time traveling around EU capitals. I spend a lot of time in Brussels, in Paris. There is huge frustration at the coalition in most of the other European capitals and in Brussels. And I think that's partly due to original expectations. When you think about how the coalition came together, we have a team around Olaf Scholz when he was finance minister that delivered Next Generation EU. We have Greens in the coalition, and there was a very forward-leaning coalition agreement. So I think all of that created this expectation that Germany and this coalition was going to put Europe center stage. And I think those expectations have obviously proven to be wrong. They were misplaced. And they're being dampened further by the fact there is a coalition that has become even more introspective as the AfD surges, as growth in Germany is flatlining, and of course, in the aftermath of a constitutional court ruling last November that effectively determined the way the government is financing its domestic agenda is unconstitutional. And that has forced the coalition into a rearguard maneuver where they are having to cut from their budget in order to respect the strictures of their constitutional court. So Germany cut 20 billion from the budget last year. That's close to 1% of GDP. And they have to find an additional 30 billion this year. That's 1.5% of GDP, running into a potential technical recession where there are major concerns about competitiveness in the EU. It is true that Scholz is Ukraine's most important fiscal contributor and champion, 17.7 billion to date. But the concern you hear in Europe is that this figure is something of a displacement activity. It enables the Chancellery not to take a far-sighted strategic position on Ukraine or the risks presented by Donald Trump, because they can hide behind the number and simply say the rest of Europe needs to do what we are doing. And that, I think, is a major problem and a major question hanging over von der Leyen's next mandate. Now, it's true that the Christian Democrats in the form of Friedrich Merz may win the Chancellery next September. That's what we think will happen. He is our base case. And he would certainly bring bigger ambition to the Chancellery. Of course, as we know, Friedrich Merz is a disciple of Wolfgang Schäuble, and so I think he would be more ambitious. He would lean more into Europe. But even Merz has his own fiscal ideology, and even Merz would govern in the context of a coalition. So even he would be constrained. This then, I think, as I've said, is the bigger risk for Europe. I think we pay less attention to Brussels, and we should pay more attention to what's happening in Paris, in Berlin, and in Rome, which I will talk about in a second. And it's in that context that this Weimar Triangle, I think, has become really important. So, the Weimar Triangle is effectively serving as a vehicle to facilitate now alignment between France and Germany. I think effectively we've got a very weak France, we've got a very weak Germany, and because they're both so weak, forcing consensus and convergence between Paris and Berlin is proving to be really challenging, and that's where I think Poland is playing a really important role. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. So there is complete agreement within Europe about support for Ukraine this year. Right? 50 billion in the Ukraine facility that runs until 2027. There is a really interesting discussion taking place now in the G7 over leveraging these frozen Russian assets to provide an additional 50 billion for Ukraine this year. There is a commitment to integrate Ukraine into the EU over the medium term, and there are a set of bilateral treaties, commitments that are being negotiated with 32 countries and Kiev, and all of those are coming together. So that's a fairly robust prospectus, and I think Europe is fully committed to that endeavor. However, there is no agreement within the EU about what to do if Donald Trump wins and the strategic problems and challenges that he would pose. Trump is saying he's going to end the Ukraine war in 24 hours. Many senior officials I talk to don't even think Europe will be represented in that conversation. They think it will happen before the inauguration, in the transition. It's a phone call to Putin, and it's a bilateral agreement that starves Zelensky of weapons and forces a peace deal that results in major territorial concessions. And Europe isn't even represented. It's not the G7, it's not the member states, it's certainly not Charles Michel, it's probably not von der Leyen. And that, I think that complex does raise questions about, in particular, Olaf Scholz, given the proximity of the Chancellery's position to the US on all Ukraine-related issues. The silent concern I hear in Brussels a lot is that if you fast forward to September, you have a politically ambivalent Chancellor, further weakened by European elections, further weakened by 3 defeats in regional elections in September, who will find it even harder at that point to navigate the internal divisions within his Social Democratic Party and the inclinations of the SPD to go along with whatever Trump and Putin agree to do in Ukraine. And maybe this will not come to pass, right? Maybe Trump will not win, but best case scenario, that's a 45% risk. Maybe it's the base case for some people. It's certainly not a tail risk, this scenario materializing in a few months' time. And so it's in those circumstances that Weimar, I think, is proving to be really important in applying what I call gentle pressure on Scholz and on Macron to ensure they align behind a united EU response and to ensure that they stay true to the commitments and accountable to the commitments that they've made with respect to Ukraine. And I think Poland and Tusk in particular, because of the election result he delivered in Poland, because of Poland's geographic positioning, and because Poland next year will spend 5% of its GDP on defense, is the leader with the agency, the legitimacy, and the credibility to force a reckoning between Paris and Berlin on these questions. So Weimar is really important, and I think it's definitely worth paying attention to. Now, I've been talking about Italy and Meloni a lot, so I just want to say a very few brief words about her. The situation I've painted in Paris and Berlin really does contrast with the situation in Italy. I would argue Meloni's star in Europe is stratospheric. She's probably the only leader of importance that will come out of the European elections strengthened, not weakened, as a result of this vote. But it remains really unclear to many people what kind of player Meloni wants to be. And there are 2 hypotheses. One is that she's fundamentally pitching for the center. The other is that she's a dangerous populist. Her real colors are only going to be revealed on the 5th of November, when Donald Trump wins and moves to the White House, and that enables her to break ranks with the European Union. Now, the analysis that she's constructive goes something like this. She sees a big gap in her domestic market in Italy. Berlusconi has died. If you look at the performance of the League on the far right, Matteo Salvini, they're not performing well. And Meloni can effectively straddle the right, from the far right to the center, and govern for the foreseeable future. So she aims to be a major player running from the center that will enable her to effectively consolidate power in Italy. And that she also sees returns in Brussels from being constructive. So she is a populist, yes, and she is an ideologue, yes, but it's targeted and it's tactical. She plays to the base and throws the base red meat on immigration. She plays to domestic culture wars. But she does that precisely so she can expand her political space and run a centrist, sensible policy where it matters most for Italy and matters most for the EU. So that's economic policy, it's Europe policy, and it's foreign policy on Ukraine. And I think this analysis I'm presenting, I think, is the assessment shared by most of the people I talk to in Brussels. This is the game Meloni is playing. They're quite comfortable with the game that she's playing. And they believe in Brussels, her political group, the ECR, she will drag them to the center because she sees political advantage from supporting von der Leyen, albeit from outside her majority. And she would get lots of rewards. A major position for Italy in the context of the next mandate. People talk about a super industrial policy portfolio that she could run. Or maybe it's the budget, or it's migration, or it's single market. Maybe it's defense. Maybe Meloni and the ECR gets a European vice president position, an EVP position. They don't exist for the ECR yet. Maybe Meloni will deliver one. And of course, she will have tremendous leverage over von der Leyen's next mandate, because she will ultimately determine whether or not von der Leyen has a comfortable majority when she aims to pass legislation. Now, is this naive? There are some really smart voices who think so, and you'll be hearing from one of them, Natalie, right after me. So the cynics, or perhaps I should call them the realists, they see Meloni as a wolf in sheep's clothing, and they point to one thing in particular, her domestic plans to consolidate power that are only now kicking into gear. So what are these plans? In the last few months, Meloni has tightened control of the state media, and she's done it more brazenly. State TV has always been subject to the spoils of office in Italy, but this time the government's going further. They're appointing friendly editors, they're freeing government officials from time limits on newsreels and talk shows. Meloni only gives interviews with sympathetic anchors, and press conferences are very rare. She's consolidated control over Mediaset, that's the late Berlusconi's TV empire, which gives the government de facto control over 6 out of the 7 media organizations in the country. She's championing a constitutional reform that will swing powers away from the presidency and towards the prime minister's office, or towards the executive. And she's also championing an electoral reform that will favor the largest party, so her party. These power grabs, of course, are raising eyebrows because they sponsor the question, maybe we've got the analysis completely back to front. Maybe Meloni is playing nice in Europe so she can consolidate power back home, just like Viktor Orban did when he came to power in 2010. Now, perhaps it's too soon to tell, but seen from Europe, I think the view is Meloni will be constructive over the short to medium term, and the major reason, I think, for that is out of necessity, because of her major Achilles heel, which is the economy. If you look at Italy's debt and deficit level, if you look at its anemic growth rates, these are all a major constraint on how crazy, if I can put it that way, Meloni can be. The Recovery and Resilience Facility keeps dispersing. Every disbursement to Italy is 20 billion euros, that's 1% of GDP. The country has no economic strategy or fiscal space without disbursements from this facility. And so that also gives Brussels leverage against Meloni, just as Meloni has leverage against Brussels. And I think that's probably the symbiotic relationship that will continue for the foreseeable future. So 2 final points. I think the developments in Paris, in Berlin, in Warsaw, and in Rome are going to be absolutely critical for how power is organized in the EU over the next 5 years. I think that will matter more than the game in Brussels between the European Parliament and the institutions. It will determine what Europe can do over the next several years. And I think, obviously, the most important political question is whether the constellation I've described will enable another next generation EU type of initiative to emerge for the purposes of security and defense. That's the big political fight that is coming down the track. I think it's too soon to tell whether the French will succeed or will be blocked, but that, I think, is the major debate to think about. And my final and concluding point is on the UK. So I'd ask you all, of course, to spare a thought for us. Living in the UK since Brexit, we've been through a huge amount of trauma since 2016 over the last 8 years. But the government is changing. There is an election, 4th of July. Labour is going to win. I think they're going to win with a very large majority. And I think that's going to be very meaningful for the UK and very meaningful for UK-EU relations. I think Starmer, as Prime Minister, will lean into the security and defense agenda in a very proactive way. And for that reason, if no other, I think it's very positive for European collective security and defense, and perhaps a slightly more positive and nicer note to conclude on. Thanks very much.
Excellent. For a very rich sort of presentation. I'm not sure I'll dare to invite you again, but when you said gloom, I actually looked down my papers here and I found this quote by Olaf Scholz and Macron in the Financial Times the other day. Europe is experiencing its Zeitenwende. We can't take for granted foundations on which we have built our European way of living and our role in the world. Our Europe is mortal and we must rise to the challenge, quote unquote. What on earth does this actually mean when you're traveling around Europe? Are we in some kind of breakdown scenario here? What does it mean to be immortal? And if we are moving towards a breakdown scenario, what could be the breaking point? Or is this completely sort of just writing a newspaper article in Financial Times?
So the op-ed is interesting. I think so the Franco-German relationship is not working well. There isn't great chemistry between the two leaders. Their teams aren't very aligned. And on substance, there's not really a shared assessment of the challenges or risks posed by Donald Trump and the implications. And so typically what we're getting is a lot of symbolism, joint op-eds, press conferences. Macron was on his state visit in Germany a few days ago, but very little of substances is coming out. I think what the French are really pushing for and will really lean into is an attempt to stand up more common financing for the purposes of security and defense. He will, I think, extract commitments from von der Leyen in the context of the strategic agenda and the next work program. That the Commission will pursue that agenda. I think if von der Leyen does not commit to do that, the French will not back her, which is why Macron keeps floating these ideas about Mario Draghi. And the key question there, I think, is whether Germany, in light of its own fiscal problems and challenges, is willing to get behind that kind of initiative and do so quickly.
And the term mortality then means what?
I mean, I think the term mortality from Macron's perspective is if we don't nurture Europe, if we don't take care of Europe, if we don't identify the challenges and make the necessary investments, then it's not clear that the European Union will necessarily survive. That commitments and investments need to be made. And as I say, in order to enable and facilitate those, common financing is necessary.
And the relationship with Donald Trump, the overall war going on in Ukraine, could that be a breaking point, or is that not sort of what we should worry about?
It's hard.
You said about the 24 hours conversation that Europe could possibly not be part of that. What's your sort of thinking with regards to that, if you try to help us with sort of creating various scenarios here?
Yeah, it's very hard. So I think, we've done a lot of work on what we think Trump can and can't do with respect to the Ukraine war. And I think our own assessment is he can probably negotiate a ceasefire. Very hard to see a long-term peace deal emerging because the interests of Zelensky and Putin simply don't overlap to deliver a sustainable peace. When you think about Trump's broader agenda on NATO, he's more transactional. It's not clear to me that that equilibrium will be perceived as a galvanizing moment in the EU for really ambitious action. So I think what I'm saying is we would need to see we would need another shock, something more detrimental. I think Trump coming into the White House, being transactional on the security guarantee, trying to impose a peace on Ukraine, I don't think that will be enough. I think a lot of that has been internalized and already socialized. So you'll need a bigger shock to really get movement. And I think movement in the Nordic countries, more movement in Germany, and more movement in the Netherlands.
And we'll follow up on that when we get to the part of the conference where we debate what actually happens if Trump wins, or for that matter, if Biden wins. You spoke about probabilities, and then you said that it was most likely that Antonio Costa from Portugal would become the new president of the European Council. Well, this is obviously not an issue that we are interested in here, right? At all. But there may be some journalists here who are trying to plan their holidays, right? Because we have the European Championship of Football, we have the Tour de France, we have the Olympics, as you also just mentioned. So what about sort of the planning for Danish politics? Because if Mette Frederiksen goes to Brussels, then you have to figure out when you're going to have your holiday, but then you say we don't have to worry about that because that's not going to happen, right? Or what was your point?
Yeah, so look, I think so. The socialists in the last 2 or 3 terms, 3 I think, took the HRVP role. And nobody really wants the HRVP role anymore because Borrella's been abysmal, because Mogherini was better.
The so-called foreign minister. Yep.
Yeah, Mogherini was better with Natalie's support. Cathy Ashton obviously set up that institution, but I think with the Commission moving into foreign affairs and defence issues, and with countries jealously guarding their sovereignty, that institution has just become a lot less interesting and a lot less attractive. So the socialists want the European Council, that's clear. And I think Michel has been a disaster. Most people I speak to are of the view an older politician at the end of his or her political life, who will not be driven by media headlines, who is a capable backroom operator, consummate diplomat, has good relations with leaders. That's the kind of profile you want in the roles. People talk about Herman Van Rompuy. You'll remember he was the first permanent European
poems, yeah.
president. Exactly. And so I think Costa is perceived or seen to be the candidate that most explicitly fills that role. Of course, your own prime minister is a candidate. The concerns...
Not officially.
Not officially. Yes. But I think the concerns will be, with von der Leyen in the Commission, that would result in an over-representation of the North in the EU's top jobs. And of course, then there is the question of the euro and not being a euro area member state. Now, that didn't
Is that a problem these days?
It didn't prevent Donald Tusk getting the role. But I think something spectacularly wrong will have to happen with Costa. So probably this corruption probe that's hanging over his government. His chief of staff had 50 billion euros in his office. That doesn't seem to be enough to scare people, him getting this role. But I think unless he is directly implicated in that probe, and that seems to be very unlikely, I suspect he will be heading to Brussels for the next 2 years.
And so, a very frank question. Does it actually matter? I mean, it matters obviously for Danish politics and also other countries. I mean, if it's a prime minister goes to Brussels. But I mean, when you spoke about the European Parliament, I was quite struck that you kind of seemed to indicate that it will not really matter that much, the election that we are sort of about to have. So does it really matter then who gets these positions?
So I think certainly for the Commission and the Council, it absolutely matters.
Okay.
They're the 2 most important institutions from my view in Brussels. I've spent a lot of time talking about the leadership deficit that we're confronted with in the EU. I think the perspective on that deficit will grow over time, given the challenges both Macron and Scholz are facing. Von der Leyen had an exceptional first term. Given the strategic challenges she faces in the next term, it's unclear whether she will be as strong and able to be as ambitious as she was in her first. So in that context, I think the individual in the European Council and the agency they can bring to forcing compromise on these questions will be really, really important.
And if Denmark, as I understand, we will not have the President of the European Council, but if you look into your crystal ball and you look upon the next Commission, which role would actually be really good for a country like Denmark to have? We also have the Danish EU presidency coming along. Which issue should we sort of focus upon? Which dossier?
So, of course, it should be the security and the defence industrial policy portfolio that the Commission is now in the process of creating. The problem, of course, is you face stiff competition from Radek Sikorski, so Poland's foreign minister. They are absolutely gunning for the role. I think Radek, there will be an important role for Poland's foreign minister in the context of what may come to pass in Russia and Ukraine in the 3rd or 4th quarter. And so someone like Radek, I think, is only minded to take that kind of job if it is meaningful, if it comes with real power, if it controls real money.
And will it come with real power?
I don't know, that's to be seen. But I think there are many countries that are competing for that position. And I suspect your Prime Minister, if there is an EVP position that straddles security, defence and industrial policy issues, that would be big enough and meaty enough for a sitting or former Prime Minister. But as I say, we'll face stiff competition from Poland and other member states that are also gunning for that role.
Excellent. Thank you very much for coming. Let's give a big hand.